Everyone, for joining this afternoon session. I'm just going to say my brother is in attendance at this conference and chose not to come here. So thank you all for being here. Uh, you know, no, I thank you all for being here. So I'm Caitlin Augustine. I'm the Vice President of Product and Programs at DataKind. I'm joined by amazing panelists here, really spanning the world of builders, of implementers, of ecosystem creators and sustainers. And we're going to have a great conversation about digital public infrastructure and data standards. And we've been talking about DPI for the past 2 days. And I've definitely been in a couple of rooms where people are like, DPI is so important, and I'm not quite sure what it is. So I actually have a printed out definition here, but the OECD defines DPI as the shared digital systems that are secure, interoperable, and designed to support the inclusive delivery of public and private services. So they are the infrastructure that gets our information to places, that helps us make decisions on where resources go. They are that digital environment. So when we think about our infrastructure of highways, if you all flew in to the airport and you were driving to this hotel, you saw a big sign saying that the infrastructure is the future of finance here in Nairobi, and there's going to be a conference in a couple of weeks about that. So infrastructure, this built digital environment, is really key. And in recent years, this has showed up as national ID systems. It's been financial services. It's been social protections. It's been healthcare. It's been emergency assistance. And it's really been interoperable data exchanges kind of at all levels. And the benefit of DPI is that it's been able to provide these services while lowering costs and enabling faster, more coordinated care and support. But at the same time, these are becoming more embedded. Expectations are naturally rising, right? This infrastructure is serving millions of citizens. It has to operate efficiently, and it has to earn our trust. And so when we think about it, we primarily think about the growth of innovation, the growth of this infrastructure as a scaling benefit, but we don't really talk about the power, right? So who shapes these systems? What are the standards that are encoded, the decisions that are made within it? Whose opinions get prioritized and whose get left out? And that's really the conversation that we want to have here today. We're starting with the premise that infrastructure is not neutral. The choices that we make about the fundamental data standards, what gets captured, how systems connect, who controls the data, have real consequences for the equity, access, and trust of these systems. And so with that, I would say it's rising in severity as we think about how AI becomes embedded in these public services, right? The cracks become more visible, the fragmented data, the lack of interoperability, the limited ways for people to carry their context across systems. So with all of that kind of setup here, I'm going to now turn over to my panel and start actually with you, Justice. You are an implementer, a community leader. Let's start just concretely. Where do these fragmented or closed data standards show up as real problems in your work, and what do they actually cost?
Thank you, Caitlin. So I cut across both national and county community level, subnational level, in climate and health intersection. And one of the things I must let you know is I think there is limited ecosystem thinking and approach when it comes to the climate and health nexus. Most of the systems that are in place are unevenly stacked, and they follow conventional, if you look at public sector, they follow conventional line ministry methods. Health works for health, climate works for climate. But when you bring in the integration, that is where the challenge comes in. And then you find structures or methods that are also not aligned. Some of the areas you see in climate and health includes timescale challenges. Climate science data is a forecast data, looks into the future, can predict 7 days in advance. Health data, you may have to wait for a quarter after the event or half a year to be able to consolidate and aggregate the narrative. And the challenge you face beyond there is how to create attribution indicators to show cause and effect. So these are the areas where I see challenges in terms, it increases the transaction cost when you want to now try and create attribution indicator between the cause and effect. Some of the aspects in climate we see in the areas of compounding variabilities. You'll find in extreme heat, you're faced with heat and strong winds, and many other factors come alongside that, including drought. And so when you want to try and look at the health aspects, those timescales are challenging to align, and you'd have to really do lots of triangulation to be able to make sense of it. And I also see a situation where science, scientific world, is also not in tune with the policy regime. So policy and science still don't work in tandem when it comes to systemic aspects around data. And so generally what this needs is an ecosystem thinking, system level thinking, where both constituencies, health and climate, can be able to work in tandem to be able to even out all these friction points when it comes to data. The other element I would wish to mention is in the area of AI. While AI has matured, when it comes to this specific sector, you'll find AI is nuanced differently. There are AI aspects that are device specific when it comes to health sector. They're looking at the augmented realities and all those kind of things, but not in the climate health space. And so we are even finding ourselves wading into this climate health space as rookies. We are now stepping into a space where we know that health requires climate focus and information to be able to make sense of interventions and action. So it's a broader aspect when you think about it in terms of system, governance, architecture, standards, trust. And in health, you cannot get data easily if you don't have data agreements. That's a challenge. On climate side, the data is commercialized. You cannot get it for free. You have to buy it. So it's a synchronized and a very unevenly stacked ecosystem. Thank you.
And Sonia, I want to follow up on that. So, Justice talking deeply about the climate and the health space and the delays in interconnectivity, but this is a problem that we might see other places. Like how typical is this fragmented standard space across systems?
Yeah, so I see this a lot in my work in U.S. education, post-secondary education. It's been striking to me actually throughout this conference how many parallels there are between different contexts that we're operating in when it comes to standards and DPI. So at U.S. Higher education institutions, it's very common for data to be fragmented, siloed, to the point where it's hard for institutions to understand their students. An advisor might be looking at 6 different systems to understand a student's financial situation, their academic situation, et cetera. And I think it's an environment that's really in need of standards and can really benefit from data standards and interoperability to get rid of vendor lock-in, to create ways in which we can better understand and better serve our students. So yeah, I think it's a common that is very, very similar across disciplines.
And Nick, picking up on that a little bit. So, Sonia mentioning the disconnects that lead us to not being able to provide those public services to students. Justice saying health data could be a quarter delayed. And again, it's not interconnected to the pieces of information that might let us make proactive health decisions. You are a tool builder. When you think of building these data and technology systems, and they're designed without those shared standards, or without input from the people who would ultimately be using them, what breaks down?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, that's largely the state that we find ourselves in now. So it's kind of like, this is what we find. But it's kind of 2 questions, because if it's without standards, it has a set of pros and cons. If it's without input from things like Codesign, it has a series of problems. Largely, we can't find a shared way to name things, put process in place, or implement. We're creating silos. The interoperability that Sonia mentioned becomes a problem. Ultimately, we are getting to this point where teams, both internal and external, can't agree on anything, and everything is assumed to be bespoke. So every team thinks their way of doing it is the correct way. It's hard to challenge that because there is no standard for it. And we wind up with the ultimate problem of 15 different competing standards that all could potentially be the way of doing it. We just don't know, and it's all vendor lock-in at that point.
Mentioning vendor lock-in, I think there's also just a complete disconnect between the communities where the data needs to be served. So if we think about this infrastructure relating to a person exists in education. They also exist in healthcare. They also exist in finance. There are layers of data on top of that, like climate, that inform how we would provide services, how we would assign resources, how we might provision. Now, Justice, coming back to you, talking about making this data accessible at a person level and being able to understand what happens to people. Without a shared way of speaking about this information, what becomes impossible? And I also wonder, like, we've worked together on climate and health and started to see the stories you can tell, the information that you can pull together, the decisions you can make when you do start to bring the data together. And I'm hoping you could share a little bit of your experience and examples.
Okay. So I think one of the things I've always stated is, if you're bringing a solution to a vulnerable community, but you did not involve them, that solution is against them. It will not serve their interests. They really need to get to a point where they can appreciate the value of the data that they're generating and how it can make sense to them within their lived experience. And I think from a national point of view, it's very difficult to define a holistic agenda without going to be context dependent. So you go to a county, you find the county has variables of climate effects that are different from one county to the next, but there's always a general thread you can see across all the counties. That nuance is not well established, where you can now say drought. Kenya has 29 out of the 47 counties, 29 are ASOL counties, where you can now say across the 29, this is the general pattern we are seeing. It's not easy to nuance it. You have to now go deeper into context-dependent settings. And that is how, in our collaboration between Spectrum and DataKind, we've basically interacted with communities and in a way in which they can give us some of the endemic embedded nuances that we wouldn't be able to see from general data observation. And further afield, the Kenya government has gone a step further to enact, the parliament has enacted a new framework that allows incorporation of indigenous community input in climate data and forecasting. I tell you this is true because I've been to a county where they had to slaughter a goat to open the offals, the intestine, for the rainmaker to make an interpretation, and it actually rained. And that's when they realized these people have their own mechanisms of being able to predict weather patterns. But when we come to science side, I think that is the disconnect. Research protocols are designed, but sometimes it's done in a very, very rushed, generic manner, in a way in which some nuances, anecdotes cannot be incorporated because the research protocol has standards that it must work with. And so there are things that are then missed in that process. So I think having the ability to be able to bring community evidence, they have their own ways of survival, of adaptation. I've seen situations where they see a certain plant weed called matenge here in Kenya. When it starts germinating, they can be able to predict it's either going to rain or drought is coming. They can't tell. And it actually happens that way. But this information is not, there is no framework for absorbing that kind of information. And so the indigenous community needs that pipeline of information relay that can enable them to be able to contribute to the frameworks we are building. Then we also don't have a unifying framework that brings both private and public together in a common direction. And so that is a challenge I've seen in climate and health. It will take a great effort to be able to create that framework. And I can confirm to you, digital transformation in climate and health space will not be won through code writing. It will be won through an architecture that brings governance, trust, and standards together, bringing private and public together and indigenous community within that space. Thank you.
I'm going to pass this down to you, Nick, to pick up on that, to say infrastructure isn't going to be built by the code, right? These pieces of information that are essential for delivering high quality services to our communities, to understanding the lived experience of communities, won't be built through the code. Yet you are a technologist. We are here at a technology conference talking about how we might build these tools. I'm curious, how does a community
of tools that developers can reach for and kind of hit the ground running. There is a way of working. There's an old joke that the hardest thing in development is regular expressions and off by one errors. Haha, development joke after lunch. But really, it's naming. We hate naming things, and if someone tells us how to name things ahead of time, it makes everything so much easier. And so, at the end of the day, like having a community that rallies around this one shared way of making things interoperable and not having to reinvent the wheel every time we're trying to develop one of these systems is something that only speeds us up. It is not necessarily a slowing function.
Sonia, I see you nodding here, and I know in a former life you were a developer, but now you're an ecosystem builder, and you're thinking about how AI gets embedded in these public systems. So if we have this shared architecture that is supposed to be representing our communities to help us make decisions to understand finance, health, education, as we bring AI into these public systems, how do the data standards shape what those systems can actually do, or what they fail to do?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is data standards make AI systems interoperable. They can talk to each other. They can understand the data that is stored in various places. And that makes the inferences coming out of these systems more accurate, more useful. And so this interoperability is a huge unlock, I think, of following data standards. Also, they allow institutions to share data more consistently and more accurately. So like coming back to the US education example, if a student is transferring between institutions, it doesn't have to be this difficult thing to move along their profile about what classes they've taken. And there's so much efficiency that's actually unlocked with that. And then also standards determine who gets represented in data. I think you alluded to this in your intro. We can, as we build good standards, we can ensure that those that are often left behind by technology or those that are underrepresented are represented in these new AI systems by literally defining the fields. Like Nick said, naming stuff is very important when it comes to software development. Different categories of things make sure that technology can actually understand who exists and who's being represented by that technology. And so all of this, again, affects the quality of inferences that we get out of these systems. I think that's a very important aspect to this.
And I think kind of pulling on that, so if we have interoperable data, we then have these AI tools on top of it. We also need some level of buy-in, right? That the data systems have to be used in some ways. And Justice, I'm actually going to come over to you to talk a little bit about how do we get to these shared data systems. You know, you were talking to me earlier, even today at lunch, saying, you know, we have a request for a research design trial to tell us what we already know, right? So that doesn't sound co-created. So when we think about co-creation, you know, there's often this technology perspective that co-design slows things down. But as an implementer, you know, just based on your experience, does it actually slow progress, or does it prevent those bigger failures down the line?
It depends on who's gonna answer that question. If you are a partner who's pressed for time because of a donor timeline to report, then the progress is slow. But if you are someone who has all the time to understand the context, it isn't slow. Climate and health space is one I define as an environment full of noise. And where there's a lot of noise, I tend to go for human connections. You need to speak to people through emotions to create those connections and build that trust. And I think it's one of the heavy lift before you can even get to the point of data agreements, before you can get buy-in. You need to come from that point of view. People need to see what is in it for them. That is why I believe co-creation and co-design is important. You need to walk this journey with people because, one, climate taxonomies are so complex. I had to go through to my county to learn how to call climate change in my mother tongue while I was running a workshop. They asked me, so what is climate change in mother tongue? And I actually stumbled. And that's when I realized we actually even need climate literacy or a dictionary that people can infer from, because they don't connect with these taxonomies. They would not even understand net zero. They have more problems like floods washed off their crops and all that. So they want to see how they can survive. So you need to speak to them through the emotions, get their buy-in, and that is when they'll start appreciating this complex environment. But if you come with these novel models, that science doesn't make sense to them. And I think science without empathy is ignorance. We need to come to that space to understand that science, research, whatever it is we are talking about, is ignorance if we do not relate with the people and their issues. That is the whole way out you start changing the paradigm shift. Technology is also good, but it makes things possible. It is people who make it happen. So you see, everything is around people. So you must speak to their emotions and create those connections. Thank you.
You know, the point you just said of, you know, having to get the language for something in your mother tongue, how does that then translate into code, right? We need that shared definition so that we can then have a shared understanding, so then we can then take shared action. And so, Nick, coming to you, kind of pulling on this co-design thread, you're a builder, and I have built things with you, and I've seen the surprise when they actually go to an audience. And so talk to us a little bit about how co-creation actually changes the technology build process.
It's tricky because it's a fun balance of you want to have ample people time ahead of actually building something to build the right thing. Discovery is far cheaper than development. It's way easier to discuss the problem than to go in the wrong direction. But that's changing. So this answer is continually interesting because now code is getting cheaper. It is much faster to develop. At the same time, that means it's much faster to develop in the wrong direction. So you can develop many features very, very quickly and put them in front of the wrong people the wrong way very, very quickly. So it's this magical balance that comes with time, experience, and kind of going people first to say, it is important that we discuss the problems. It is important that we don't spend too much time discussing the problems. And it's important to remember that no interface has ever survived contact with the actual user. All of our assumptions, all of our co-creation, everything we do, making something that you can iterate on is necessary because it never stands up to actual like field use cases. And so you can make the best assumptions. You don't want to put something in place that harms. You don't want to put something in place that is a nightmare for the current like field teams to deal with. But at the same time, you can't sit on conversation for too long. You can't discuss the problems in a venue for too long before you actually put something in front of folks.
I think that element of co-creation, getting to these workable systems. One thing we've heard a lot about in sort of all of the conversations across it is, yes, there's a data standard, but also my institution just does it this way. My organization does it this way. It's never going to work. And I think that there's a discussion about adoption here. And Sonia, I'm actually going to go to you because you are a proponent of standards. Part of the work that you fund at the Gates Foundation is getting to this level of interoperability. What actually makes a standard usable in practice?
Yeah, I might come at this from actually what gets in the way of people adopting standards. So often it's just a lack of incentives. The thing about standards is that the collective benefits from them, but the process of adopting them can sometimes introduce risk. It can feel risky for an institution to change the system that they use or the way they represent their data. Often institutional leaders are incentivized to show short-term projects, flashy short-term projects, as opposed to this like sort of eat your vegetables work of standardizing your data, which pays off in the long term. And then there's also the issue of vendors are not incentivized to make their products interoperable. Vendors are incentivized to lock in their clients, and so with standards, there often needs to be a forcing function. Often that forcing function is regulation. So there needs to be policy involved that says, hey, vendors, use this standard, make your systems interoperable. And that's often the only way that we get there.
Nick, I see you sort of going back and forth there. So curious, what would you add to?
It's tough. I feel like we've had some natural standards kind of develop organically that have become what we use every day on the open kind of standards market. So if we commonly refer to the World Wide Web Consortium, which I'll call W3C from now on because I'll trip over it otherwise. And so if you think of everything you use in a web browser, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's all defined by that consortium. They have 46 or so working groups that go out and create new standards that then make their way to the actual browser makers. All the major browser makers are part of this. And so that is a open standard that powers the current web that we rely on for all the technology that we're talking about, that has developed organically, and we rely on it, and there's no like government regulation oversight on that front. Could we create that today? I don't know. I don't think so. I think the hard part here is that it's hard to say we must have a standard that can dictate something like health or climate or education, and then who owns it? Is it distributed? Where is it actually saved? Like whose server is it running on? How do we let people move it between systems? So I don't know that we can get away from new things having some kind of regulation, but it's one of the hard problems in standards right now is who actually has the governance of this, and could we develop a new organic standard like some of the ones we rely on day to day now?
Yeah, I think picking up on that, and just as you said, no, I don't need to answer, but I'm actually going to ask you a little bit of a question here, because I think we, in the software building space, particularly in the open source community, there's now kind of this next wave of sovereignty and who gets to decide who's building, who's implementing, and again, just as in some of the conversations we've had of what needs to be built locally, how do we want to build it from scratch, what can we adopt, and I'd love you to sort of come in here and talk a bit about these build and adoption structures in the communities you work within, and what needs to be true, how do you go about standards co-creation, standards implementation?
Yeah, so I didn't want to really center on product definition, but I'm going to take that angle. The mentality with which Spectrum we approach the landscape is we look at it as a commercial venture, route to market. How would you launch a product? And I see that when it comes to climate health, most of the innovations, the funding comes through the innovation ends at innovation. The translation from product innovation development to commercialization is a missing link. And I'm not saying we have to sell it, but I'm just using that framing to show that there's a way the private sector does the route to market. In our case, what I've seen as a challenge is that sometimes solutions are built that purport to monitor a situation, but the solutions themselves end up being outdated than the situation they purport to monitor. By the time they're being deployed, the world has moved on. And I think that is where we need to change the whole paradigm, how we deploy, because climate is happening in real time, even as we are speaking. There are things going on somewhere in the world. It will not wait for that phase of development. So we have to have a cascade of the development phase, the route to market phase, so that we can gain traction with communities, because they are going on with their life. They are going on with the adaptation mechanisms, and they may not wait for these solutions that we are developing. And I think that is where we need to frame differently to find a way in which, especially at the nexus of climate and health, the speed to deployment should be in tune with the realities on the ground. I know that there's this, from a health point of view, there's always this need to self-check things by protocols, standards, and all that. But then by the time it's being launched, things have moved on, people have moved on, and the realities have changed. That nuance is tricky to manage when it comes to digital innovations, and we always have to try and create solutions that are versatile, that can evolve with the realities on the ground. If they are just one size fits all and stuck in one way of thinking, then you can be sure there will be many that will not be adopted. Having said that, there are ongoing initiatives that leverage available data without structured processes. I'm a member of a county weatherwise WhatsApp group, which has about 860 members. including former senators, former governors, and it's a pastoral community. And every week, Kenya Meteorology Department shares with us forecasts for a week in advance. Like I already have the forecast for next week. And the people who use that data so well are the farmers. And I keep asking health people, why are you not integrated with this? Oh, the data is not making sense to us. But the farmers, you'll find even an illiterate person in the group saying, is this short rains or long rains? If it is long rains, should we move up the hill to avoid a flood? Like they're making sense of, and it's in WhatsApp. So there are many other ongoing initiatives that cannot wait for our solutions. People are already living with the realities. They will see a forecast for drought and they'll ask, in the local language, naively, I don't understand this from Kenya Met. Can somebody tell me, should I start talking on silage and hay if drought is coming? And they'll be advised. So agriculture is using the data so well, but health is not. And that is why I think it's a paradigm shift. Thanks.
And I think I'm going to stick with you for a second here because I think you're emphasizing the infrastructure, right? There's this data, it exists. It is in fact interoperable. We can talk about weather data tied to our communities, tied to this geography. But what we're missing is that trust level for the adoption. And I'm curious, how do you balance the speed of technology delivery, the speed of the deployment of this technical infrastructure with the community trust? One example I think you've shared somewhat recently is in the health space, right? If you can see there's a health prediction for a community member, but they might not believe it. They might not believe that it would be for them. So could you unpack a little bit about that? It's not just that the technology needs to be built well, the speed of adoption needs to be there too.
Yeah, so the practical example that we are working on in partnership with DataKind, we are leveraging the One Health group. So the One Health group brings in social welfare, veterinary, livestock, health, public health and sanitation, because these schools have different experiences, but they can also help augment the work you're doing. And in that space, what we end up learning for the entire ecosystem, there's a lot of need for data that can inform participatory scenario planning, because everything is connected to everything else. You cannot make these disparate systems. A case in point I was sharing over lunch, in the Maasai community, when the drought is coming up, mostly the men would leave home with their cattle to go far away for months in search of pasture, but they leave their women, some are pregnant. Now, that's both a health issue and an agriculture issue. So you can't deal with them as disparate systems. That's why the One Health approach helps us to see the whole perspective of scenario planning. How do we ensure pregnant mothers will still be able to access antenatal care if they don't have the support partners who have gone to search for pasture far away? And we know drought will happen for 4 months before they come back with their cattle. So those are the scenarios we need to model for and realities we need to face when we are talking about One Health. But if you just go in because you want to address environmental issues, you'll miss so many other aspects. Your solution will just address one thing and miss. So we tend to take that approach, and that was a learning experience for us in the climate health path we are building with DataKind. Thanks, Tali has walked into the room. So we decided to form an advisory council for that solution we are building, to bring all kinds of partners who can help augment it, to build something better that meets diverse needs. We may not address everything in the space, but at least we can achieve some significant milestones.
Excellent. Talking about participatory processes, talking about this new data development, getting that understanding of something like a migration. Sonia, coming to you to talk about these systems, right? Talking about prediction, talking about decisions that are more data-driven, AI-enabled. Who should control the data, and who gets to control the outputs that then are shared and utilized? And how does that get built into our system design?
Yeah, so I think that there's many layers to that question, such as like who has agency over the data use, who defines what acceptable use of the data is, and who is accountable when systems fail. So that last one is a very important reason we always want to have humans in the loop. I know we talk about that a lot in this conference and in this space, but when AI, for example, is making decisions, it's very, very important that there is a human that's accountable for that decision when things go wrong, and that there's a way to go to somebody and say, why was this decision made? I think something incorrect, the data was incorrect, or there was something that went wrong here. And I think that's a really important layer of trust, is like you can't just automate it away. And then the other thing is co-design. I think a lot of this comes back to co-design, building trust into the system along the way, not just as an afterthought. So like, what does the community that you're building for, what are they afraid of when it comes to AI or technology? And yeah, how can we incorporate co-design into every aspect of building this technology? And then when it like comes practically to the data, I think there's the idea that no single actor should control all the data, and that we should distribute authority across stakeholders, and that we should really be able to have fine-grained control of who has access to various types of data when you're putting a lot of data into a particular system.
And I think, so co-design, participatory practices, frankly, the economies of scale and the burdens coming down on actually building out these systems and deploying any piece of technology now are quite low. And Nick, we've had some conversations of, is it these big national infrastructure systems, or is it something more bespoke, something more specific to sort of an institute, a given context, given institution? And so what I'd like to kind of have you comment on is, fragmentation in the marketplace. Every health center having their own data system deployment maybe has an underlying data standard, maybe has multiple underlying data standards. Every education institution has maybe some commonality, again, some differences. Is fragmentation something we should try to eliminate, or is it simply something we need to design around?
I think folks in tech are already seen as the bad guy. So to swoop in and say, we must swoop in and take over all data standards and you must now conform to this would be very bad. I think we have to embrace it. It is definitely the current state. And we have to start at a place of new technology must understand what currently exists and iterate on that until it could move to shared standards, but it is not a one-step process. One of the secrets, if you've been around a senior level developer long enough, they hate rewrites. Like they don't want to rewrite a system. A refactor is much easier. Nobody wants to pull the switch to change over data from a legacy system to a new system all in one fell swoop. It must be a slow process with tests and iteration, and a thing that happens over time in conjunction with the folks that are currently using the systems. Again, we're already the bad guys. The last thing we need to do is enforce some new standard that is not pressure tested in the field in one swoop without testing it. It's an iteratively with the folks. Now, this one's interesting though, in that it's one of the answers that is changing rapidly with AI. The idea of rewriting a system that is well tested and has been in place for a long time in a new way is possible with AI. There are very large scale examples of this that have happened in recent weeks. So that's kind of a wait and see. There's a possibility that this does change. But for now, we must embrace what's there and slowly move it from there.
I think that starting small and demonstrating success is possibly a really good point to end this part of the conversation. So I'm going to ask each of you to maybe share, give us a little bit of hope. Share something that's been working in this technology shared infrastructure space, and then I'll move to audience questions. So audience, this is like your 90-second flag to get some questions ready. But Justice, starting with you, what's worked?
What's worked is one from I participate in the National Steering Committee on Climate Change and Health. we did develop the first climate change and health strategy. And at that time, there were so many gaps in the ecosystem, and health was lagging behind in terms of the NDCs, the national determined contributions that Kenya signed into in the Paris Agreement. And what has worked is we've seen a faster evolution of policies just to catch up. We've seen the Climate Change Act updated. Kenya has had to embrace the need to develop AI in healthcare strategy, although it was not very strong. I joined the task force. I found that it was more device specific, medical device specific. It was not looking at a larger ecosystem. And so that's what we are also trying to strengthen. We are currently in the space of completing the development of the climate resilient infrastructure health facilities, targeting flooding and heat stress, including issues around design building, how to do standard design buildings that are in concurrence with the extreme heat factors in some of the counties. And this is bringing opportunities where we are seeing the built environment advocates embracing digital. They're looking at our recommendations for designing climate resilient facilities, and they're realizing we need to be compliant here. We need to be able to build facilities that are aligned, because the standard methods of building have been consistently deployed across the country without that cognizance of heat stress. So I think we've seen that evolution of policies enabling the environment to change differently. As if it was a case of a necessary evil, the end of USAID program forced Kenya government to consolidate its data protection. By formation, there was a formation of the Data Protection Commissioner's Office, answerable to the president, and there's a Data Protection Act. And also with the Gen Z misusing AI, there's a lot of measures that are coming up. So those again are impacting our space, but we need to align. And so in the development of all this, we are appreciating that they are happening at the right time and the right conversations are taking place in the right rooms as we see the evolution of climate variabilities, the evolution of policy frameworks, the digital space expanding differently. So it's giving us hope in terms of interaction. And we are looking forward to interacting with one of the counties where we are piloting climate health pulse with DataKind to be able to interact with AI. So this is a first of its kind. If you think about it, we are getting into the right spaces. Thank you.
Yeah, so one particular standard that I have tried to learn from in my work and that I think of as sort of a story of success is the FHIR standard, which is a healthcare interoperability standard that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's a common way to structure and exchange data through APIs with regard to health information. And it has now been broadly adopted in the US market. And one thing that I think has contributed to its success is that it's balanced providing this like structured data model with also flexibility to allow builders to build on top of that. So it's a balance of structure and flexibility, and also a sort of like an example of organic adoption for a standard that then became regulation. So it's a standard that I feel that I've learned a lot from and gives me hope. And I know Nick knows a lot more about all this, so I'll pass it to him.
No, going more toward the co-design side, and after seeing M-Pesa in country too, like this plays with that. In 2017 in Brazil, 77% or so of transactions were still done via cash. They really wanted to move toward a more digital transaction system. So they worked with the community to find out, what are the barriers to entry? What do we need to do correctly to enable that? And so there's a system called PIX, P-I-X. And as of 2024, 70% or so of the country is actively using it. And it allows folks in the community to have either a phone number, an email address, or a unique ID to make those kinds of transactions. So they figured out that a lot of the barriers had to do with either technology or access to bank accounts or access to these kind of unique identifiers. And so getting over that as part of co-design allowed them to generate something that has had kind of widespread adoption very, very quickly.
All right, audience, we have a time for maybe 4 questions. I'm going to ask folks maybe can raise their hand, and then we have a runner who's able to come through. So Excellent. Let's start up here in the front. So, and maybe we'll take 2 questions at a time. That way our panelists can jointly kind of respond across. So first question, can you introduce yourself also?
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Susan Maswili. I am a software engineer. I work with people in need. And I wanted to comment on what Justice is doing. It's a very good job when it comes to communications to the grassroots. So what we do as people in need, we develop solutions for like disaster management and also early warning systems. For example, I'll say flood, where we have like early warning systems to alert the like the citizens when the floods are coming. And one of the things that has helped us is sending SMSs, which is a very like available tool. So I don't know what you're doing when it comes to the communication to those grassroots, apart from like going there physically or the radios. What else do you do to just inform them about the climate change? Thank you.
We have a question from online audience, Candy. She's asking, why do you think climate is using the data so well compared to health? Is it because the climate sector is able to easily communicate the point to those in the agricultural sector?
All right. So just to repeat both questions that we've heard. So one is really about communication specifically to you, Justice, but also I would say to our whole panel, how do you actually communicate about the information? How do you get that trust in the information that's communicated? And the second is adoption, right? Uneven adoption across sectors of the same set of data. So it's not a data access or a data interoperability barrier, it's a usage barrier. So maybe Justice, we'll start with you, but then Sonia or Nick, I'd hope you come in as well.
I hope I remember those questions in the way they were asked. So communication, I did participate in my first ever podcast with an organization called Scilink. They're here in Nairobi. And one of the things I did mention to them, scientific language is too technical. If you really want to reach community, scientific language is too technical. We need to nuance it in a way in which the community can understand. And I want to tie that with the second question. The reason why climate data is easily used in other sectors is because the dissemination structures for communicating climate information is interestingly organized on the environment and agriculture side. In each county, Kenya Meteorology, participating with the county governments, established weather groups. And these weather groups have established additional weather groups. I'm talking of WhatsApp groups. And these are the channels through which the county directors of health or meteorology receive forecasts every week and distribute it, including the group of which I am a part in one of the Asol counties. Every week, you get the forecast a week, 7 days in advance. You get the quarterly. And the thing is, there are community media houses that have been established in vernacular language that the Kenya Meteorology and Ministry of Environment is using to communicate. So if you go to the Maasai, they have the channel. If you go to the Kisii, they have the channel. We don't have that for health. Health still remains in its scientific frame at conferences and summits where communication is very technical and the models are difficult to understand. And so at the end of the day, that's a challenge we do face between the two dichotomous sectors, where health needs to try and see how scientific communication can be made understandable. And then also health needs to stop this pervasive vulnerability narrative. I think that is what health has been associated with. Vulnerable, on the edge for collapse, I don't know what, it's always in that direction. Well, climate affects every other sector. And so maybe health needs to find a new way of communicating. Like you've just asked us, can we say something positive? Everything looks grim. Something like that. It would help greatly. Thank you.
You follow that. I think, speaking more broadly to trust, we're back to community. There is a definite need in all sectors really to find a way to document current standards or the right way of doing it, or at least how the fragmented standards are being implemented. And then it's a matter of changing it over time in a documented way as well. So there's a version control aspect to it. There is a telling people what's going to change, doing so through proposals, letting folks have input on upcoming changes. And then when it is implemented, giving the previous method of doing it time to be spun down and deprecated so that it's not an instant change. It's not cutting anybody out at the knees. It is this is going to happen. This is why it's going to happen. We discuss why it's going to happen. You have time to make this happen. It is now happening. Okay, now we're actually making the previous way of doing this not accepted.
Excellent. We're getting the high sign that we're at the end here. So I know there were additional questions. Our panelists will be around here and outside. Please ask them questions. And just to pull a couple of threads together here, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, and the infrastructure really is our common way of talking, our common way of understanding. But that common language, that common set of insights only gets so far. It's really about the communication of that information. And it's really the technical is a solvable problem. It's the social, it's the institutional pieces, and hearing bright spots of policy change that comes alongside the technical build. Hearing success from co-design, ensuring representation of lived experience, community engagement within these data systems and the use. So understanding multiple ways of identification, understanding multiple ways of representing Indigenous knowledge within our codified systems are really key. And yes, there is fragmentation, and this is a place where we are seeing benefits of our new technology or technological environment, where AI and other tools are lowering that sort of barrier to access, to making things interoperable, to really start to work at these larger scales with these data problems. So with that, I really want to thank everyone for being here and being a part of this conversation. Again, we will be around to answer more questions. And then if you're looking for a call to action, if you're like, man, you know what? Lunch after or standards after lunch, and I didn't fall asleep and I'm so excited. DataKind is part of a number of these consortiums, including Spectrum Africa, including the Gates Foundation, of building out community co-created standards in a number of spaces, in health, in climate, in education. Please come talk to us to be a part of that greater community, because we want to include your voices as well.